Okay, everyone, welcome to the review for our first class in Multimedia Authoring 2. We're just going to go over the basic layout and tools of Animate in case you need to review or miss class or anything like that. So when you open up the program, it's going to look similar to this. There's nothing here. You can't get to any of the tools, and that's because we have to actually open something to work on for any of this to work. You might have a pop-up that comes up here. Otherwise, you can go to File, Open. File, New. And you get something that looks similar to this. Your layout might be slightly different. But what you're looking for is these file types. Now, in a lot of programs, the file type will matter in terms of how it's saved. So PSD is different than a TIFF, things like that. But in this case, these actually change how the underlying structure of the file functions, which means if you chose HTML5, for example, you will not be able to do all of the things we talk about in animation because it's limited, because HTML5 is limited. So we always start in this class with Action Scripting 3.0. We are not actually going to use Action Scripting anymore because that's being done away with, and eventually they'll probably change what this is called. But in the meantime, that's what you want to start with, and so we hit OK, and it opens up. Now, before I go any further, your layout might look different than mine. If you go to Window, Workspaces, I have it set to Classic because in class we need to make sure the layers are up at the top because otherwise people can't see it. So you're probably starting in something that's either Animator or Designer or something like that. So if you set it to Classic, it can look like this. And the other thing you'll notice is that this is a very small work area. It is 550, if I go to my Properties tab here, it's 550 by 400. This is a throwback to ye olde days, where your old monitors, the really, really big ones that weighed 80 pounds, were only 800 by 600 pixels. And so that's what this is meant to be. It's meant to be if you have something that's 800 by 600 pixels and you have a browser bar and sliders and everything, the taskbar underneath, all those kinds of things, that this is about what you're left with in terms of workspace. Obviously, we are not in that world anymore. You can always click anywhere on the background in this workspace, and then properties, which are always in this giant tab over here. If we change the size there, 1920 by 1080 is standard HD setup. And you can either, I'm using hotkeys for a lot of things, so Control minus, Control plus, which should be listed down there, to change things, or you can go here actually and fit in window, which will fit the whole thing, the whole workspace in for us, which is nice. Alright, so we can change the size of this at any time. It's always going to change from this top part, just so you know. But we have our tools on this side. We have our layers and timeline, which are interconnected. They're over here. And we have properties panel, which is sort of always open by default. And there are other panels that we'll kind of get to as the weeks go on. But these are kind of hidden over here. So in our toolbar, the top few tools are about selection. The next several tools are all about drawing, so they make things. The next few tools are about manipulating the things that you've made, but they're all very, very, very different. Paint Bucket is not the same as a bone tool, not even remotely. We've got a couple navigational tools, and then the rest of this is actually properties of the thing you have selected. So if you select, say, the rectangle tool to draw a shape, then you've got the colors you can work with, and then also some things, other options for your tools. So your tools and options for your tools are in the same bar. So I'm going to select the rectangle, but I'm going to change these colors because they're both black. So the one with the paint bucket, that's the fill. I'm going to stick with swatches for now just because it's easier. But I'm going to select that for the fill, and then this is the stroke. So it's the outline color. That's going to be ugly. There we go. And when I draw that, right, looks like a rectangle with a blue outline. We can really not see the blue outline very much. So I'm going to select it and just properties now change because I have something different selected. I'm just going to make it bigger so you guys can see it. So you can see that this is a vector program. So for those who don't know, a vector program is one that instead of pixels, which is an array of bits that are kind of locked in, like a photograph, this is math. So there's an anchor point here and there's an anchor point here, and then there's math saying draw a straight line. We can curve it and then the math will say draw a curved line. What that means is that we can zoom in infinitely. So I'm gonna focus on that, and I'm at 2000%, and you can see it's still a straight line. Now, when you output this, it becomes a raster. It unvectors. So just be aware that that will not always be a vector and not always be scalable. But that's how it works. The other nice thing about vector is that you can kind of change things after the fact all the time. So if I click on this interior and I select a color, I can change the color. There we go. Because it's math drawing it, I don't have to use magic wand tools or profiles, or not profiles, like silhouettes, like none of that. It works. Likewise, if I double click to get the line, more on that later, I can change that color too. Change it to a dark green, whatever I want, and it'll work. Now, if you're familiar with Illustrator, this is going to feel like working in mud because it's a different enough, but it's similar enough that it feels like it should be right and it's not. And one of those weird things is that the interior is separate from the exterior. And if I click once to select it and then drag, it does this. So even though I drew this as a rectangle, it's not considered one single object. We have to do work to make that happen, which we'll get into next time. I'm going to Control Z to undo. That's your second most important hotkey. So, and even the lines are considered separate, which I know sounds crazy, but that's how it is. So if you want to select the whole thing, you would just double click on it and it takes the whole thing, and you can get all of your properties for everything, and you can change all of your properties on everything. But if you don't double click it, you don't actually get all the pieces. Now I'm going to grab another tool. I'm going to make it a different color. All right, so make that there, and I keep going back to my selection tool, which is V on your keyboard. Now if I drag this over here, if I let go and then bring it back, it does this. So in some ways these are like Photoshop layers in that they interact with each other, but you can separate the pieces very easily because they're vector. Now this can work to your advantage. Cutting a circle out of this was easy. I mean, in Illustrator, that you would actually probably just have to make a white circle and put it on top, because trying to cut a hole into this is just not, it's harder. But on the other hand, that's a pain because you can accidentally cut into things. So you have to be aware that it's happening as you're drawing. And if I click here, by the way, you can see it breaks up the line too. Now I want to go over how these things function differently, the fill and the stroke, because they do. By the way, spacebar gives you the hand tool, also the pan tool you call it, and it lets you pan around. So, whoa, nope. There we are. So what's technically going on? A fill is, if I grab my sub-selection tool, you can see the outline. And you can kind of barely see the outline. It's very, very small. Unfortunately, I can't make it look any bigger, even if I zoom in. But what's happening is this outline is basically describing whatever the exterior is, and then it gets filled in with green. And so you can be very, very specific, and you can get shapes like that. And that's why when you put the circle on, it cuts it out exactly. That's not what happened with the stroke, because the stroke doesn't think like that. What happens is, actually let me move it separate so that we can see it. Nope. Flash considers whether you have something selected or not. More on that in a second. Aha, there we go. So what's happening with this is that it is a line, but it's not getting filled in, it's actually kind of getting filled out. So when you have this single line, and then you say be 11.5 pixels sort of across the line, and then this edge is actually defined over here with the cap, and you can make it to none, or you can make it to square, which kind of extends past the line. There we go. But that's how it's defined, and that means that when you cut into it, yeah, it cuts off here, it puts an anchor point here where the circle was, but this continues on. And even if I select it and tell it to have no cap on it, you can see it's not matching this, because the stroke can't. That's not how it thinks. So technically, if you needed both of these to match with this curve, you would actually need this to be a filled-in shape. You would have to make a filled-in shape that looks like that and then cut across it, which seems counterintuitive, but vectors, that's how they think, and that's what we have to work with. Because they're computerized, because they're math, they're a little bit less intuitive, and they're a little bit more like you got to figure out how to communicate with them. By the way, I said that Control Z was the second most important hotkey. Control S would be the most important. So what happens is, let's go to week 1 here. When you go to save, if you haven't saved yet, because it's all just called an untitled one, it will actually bring up this dialog box because it's got to know like where to put it and what to call it. You know, until this moment, this file didn't exist anywhere except in like a temp folder. So good file naming conventions. I'm going to put my name on it, and it's going to save as a Flash file. That is the only file you should save as, ever, because it's the only file you can have where you can work on things after the fact. So I hit save, and now once I do that, I'm going to make a couple changes here just to make changes. Now from now on, when I go to save, it's just going to save to that place. Right, so you don't have to keep doing that. And you can know you've made changes because there's a little asterisk next to the name. And now there's not. So whenever you see that asterisk, it means that you've made changes that have not been saved yet. All right, so that's one of the things we have to deal with this, is that it's going to, these things are going to interact. If you want them to not interact, you would come over here to your layers panel and you would make a second layer. So if layer 1 is where all this other stuff is, if I go to layer 2, I can grab the pencil tool, and this is in no way interacting with these things, right? They're not cutting into each other because they're not in the same place. On that note, I'm also going to go over here to the eyeball, turn off the bottom layer, because I want to be able to see what I'm doing. So the other drawing tools besides shapes are, we're going to deal with the pencil tool and the brush tool. Don't worry about this one. If I select the pencil tool and change nothing else, I get this. If I select the brush tool and change nothing else, well, except for this because that's wrong, sorry, I get this. All right, and if you take a look at the toolbar, you'll see that the stroke is blue and the fill is pink, and that's why. So what's happening is the paintbrush works as a fill, and this works as a stroke. And we can know that by going to the, here, I'm going to change the color of this layer because we can't see the line. There we go. So if I select this, you can see the line, and then there's just one line, and it's being filled out. So it's being told the same thing as before, actually, with the 11.5. If I select this, hold on. These things are overlapping and it's making it confusing, so we're going to get rid of them. You just click them and select, hit delete. Okay, so, where'd my selection tool go? There we go. We can see the exterior is where the line is, and then it's being filled in. So paintbrush and pencil, that's the biggest difference between the two of them. One is the fill like this, and one of the stroke is like this. A couple of settings to be aware of. Let me delete some things. Zoom out. You can also click and drag across things to select them and get rid of them. The paintbrush has a few settings that we'll get into next time. The biggest ones would be brush size, which is what I changed there. This one refers to pen pressure, which I don't have a tablet, so that's not going to make any difference. So it can start off this big, or start off this big. And then there's also this shape, which needs to be bigger for me to see it. There we go. So we've got this kind of calligraphy look going on versus this oval shape. So they're very different shapes. The pencil has this one, which is basically either it's going to make it a straight line, which will, if you look at the anchor points, simplify it immensely, as few anchor points as possible. Or there's the smooth one, which has a setting over here, right? So you can turn it all the way down, or turn it all the way up. And when we do that, by the way, if I click the one that was like 50% smoothed, it looks like this. Oh, that's actually not too bad. Normally when I turn that all the way down, it goes kind of crazy. Let me see if I can get it to go crazy. Oh, I think newer versions of the software, which you guys have at the school, will have a lot more points on it, because this is still kind of smoothing it. But then the ink will be kind of like, whoops, the closest to your hand. Yeah, there's even more, and it's kind of, how much you want it to smooth depends on how much you want your hand to show, depends on how you're drawing and stuff like that. Now, a note about some of these properties, or I guess options we'll call them. So these things like the color, if I select any one of these, I can come over here and I can change the color. It's easy. Select this one, change that color, select this one, change that color. Oh, select the whole thing and change that color. And then you can also, will it let me? There we go. It'll also let you change the size here, because it's listed over here. Anything that's listed over here, you can change. You'll notice that smoothing, or whether it's straightened or smoothed or anything like that, there's no option over here. Everything that is below this bottom line is set in stone. If you select that for while you're drawing, that's it. You cannot change it after the fact. Same goes for the shape of the brush. Now I can change the color, and I'm not even sure. Okay, yeah, you can turn it into an object. But none of the rest of it is okay. Like I can't do this stuff. Change the size of the brush stroke. So if you're using the paintbrush, you can't change even the size of it after the fact. Now there's still reasons to use a paintbrush, which we'll get into in a minute, but just be aware of the fact that we can't change things. Just like that, and hit delete. The reason why you might want to use the paintbrush, if I grab, well, these colors are not going to work. We want colors that are different so we can see them. If I have something that has a fill, and then for the stroke, I select this white bar with a slash through it, that means none. So when I draw it, there's no outline. But let's say I change my mind later. I want it to be, there to be an outline. Well, I go over here, there's nothing. You can't change what doesn't exist in the properties, but you can add to it. Likewise, if I'm going to turn this off, and I'm going to grab this. There we go. So I have one stroke without a fill, and I have one fill without a stroke. Well, that's what the paint buckets are for. This one, there we go. Trying to get a color back over here. So this paint bucket will fill in the fill, basically, like this. It will not fill it in over here. The outside of your scene does not count as a border edge. It has to be a closed setting. The ink bottle tool, which looks exactly like a paint bucket, only smaller, it'll add a stroke to something that doesn't. And now you can change them as you see fit. So that's how that works. Those are the two change afterwards tools that you're going to use probably the most. Now I'm going to grab pencil, and I'm going to turn up this kind of stupidly on purpose. Wait, no, that's wrong. I'm trying to draw with a mouse. Bear with me. I think that's correct. Yes, okay, good. So I draw like that, and then I grab the the paintbrush, and I'm gonna use it, there we go. So let's say I want to fill these in with some other color, just whatever. So I grab the paint bucket, and I go over here, and that fills in perfectly, because this is a closed thing. Because this is a paintbrush, remember. So if we were to really look at, if I undo for a sec, oh, no, redo brush. If I look at this, you can see anchor point, anchor point, anchor point. You can see that these are connected. And so when I grab the paint bucket tool, hotkey is K, it works. Doesn't work over here, because this is not a pencil, it is, or I'm sorry, it's not a paintbrush, it's a pencil, which means it's a stroke, not a fill. And if we look at what's actually going on, these two lines are not overlapping. It doesn't care how much, whoop, what did I just do? Oh, well, now it's going to work. No, it's not. There we go. It doesn't care how much you've told this to be big. It only looks at the line. And since that line looks like this, it's not going to work. So you would have to use your subselection tool to go in here. Just pull the one anchor point, and now it'll work. All right, so that's one of the things to kind of take a look at. All right, so we're at the 20-minute mark. That's a good first start basis for tools. We're going to go into a couple more advanced things and layout things in your homework in part 2 of this video.